science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker to advance the frontier of architectural thinking, to help us imagine what the possibilities of architecture are in a way that is unusual. Today I'm speaking to Michael Benedikt, who is Professor of Architecture at UT Austin and who has written a series of books, all of which push the frontier of what it is that architecture can and cannot do. He's a challenging thinker, and he combines an amazing mix of what one might consider to be extremely radical perspectives on the possibilities of architecture, including discussions of the sacred and the religious, with very well-established traditional understandings of architecture. Together, he's trying to think of a new way for us to imagine and know what it is that architecture is, and therefore, by implication, what our role as architects should be as the makers of that kind of architecture. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here we go.
Doing this interview, I quickly tried to read my own book this morning.
Oh, what's wrong with you?
So that well, you know, life goes on and you start thinking about other things, and it's like, you know, it's not as burning like a furnace in me like it was, you know, a year ago or 6 months ago.
Uh-huh.
I could have recited the book to you.
6 months ago, you
Just
could have recited the book to me.
Yeah. And now I read it and I just go, gosh, this is brilliant.
Who wrote that?
Who wrote this fabulous book?
Well, it raises that question, and we can start getting into the sort of thick of this.
Okay,
here.
yeah.
I mean, you talk about who is me and who writes, actually, can be a question that can be asked.
Mm-hmm.
But when a book is written, who writes, and whether knowledge, like architecture, exists in a certain authorial realm or is really intersubjective, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, you know, I've always been of the notion that ideas come through you.
Right.
Everything depends on who you've been reading, who you've been listening to.
Indeed.
Where you went to school, who your friends were.
Totally.
Sometimes friends you almost no longer remember put ideas into your head. And your parents, oh my God, your parents.
Of
I
course.
still wake up sometimes thinking, oh my God, my father used to say that.
Yes.
My mother used to say that. And I've built a career out of what my mother said to me when I was 14.
Yes.
It's like...
And they are all themselves, you know, have other people speaking through them. So it's not like there is an originary person in your father or your professor or your friend.
So when I read Derrida, I was very responsive to that, to the fact that, you know, there is no original text.
Yes.
That all texts are supplements to other texts and so forth.
Right.
And I certainly felt that I've written like, I don't know, 8 books, maybe more if you count edited.
Yes.
And they're all channeling. They're all channeling other people.
Yeah.
And I often feel guilty, actually, that I do not pay enough respect to the people that have influenced, to the people that are actually represented. It seems like there's no amount of footnotes that can do justice to where you've. And at some point, as an existentialist, you just step up and say, well, you know, I'm saying this. And if you want to refer to it, I'm going to be the authority for you. But it's not to say that others haven't been authorities for me.
Yeah, we are stand-in
So
authorities.
And I think each generation, you included, step into a certain responsibility,
right,
to be an authority for the next generation.
But you feel guilt about it. That's the one that idea that stays with me. Why
Well,
do you?
because I can never say thank you enough. I mean,
Aha,
my footnotes would have to have footnotes, and and those footnotes would have to have footnotes.
aha. That's
And
interesting.
there's also the strange truth, I think, that often the people that we think of as great, the Newtons and the Descartes and so forth, whenever I read histories and biographies of this kind of people, you kind of go, well, the person who really had that thought was this unknown uh, teacher they had that no one ever heard of,
Right.
that actually came up with this.
Yeah.
And the people that bring great ideas into the public realm are often not the people that actually invented them or brought them into being. They're
And
secondhand
yeah,
already.
and
Yeah.
it's not like somebody else. It's like there are these great ideas, and they are circulating and recirculating and regenerating in new forms,
Yeah.
new grammars, new grammatologies,
Yes,
uh,
exactly.
new architectures, which is. I mean, it seems
Yes.
to me you are roughly defining architecture as kind of the same thing, as a
Oh,
sort of a
yes.
thing that exists intersubjectively in that sense. Yes.
Right. I mean, my book is a post-human humanism.
Right.
Um, so I'm very aware, as I read for it and wrote it and so forth, that of the formation of my ideas by humanist classical teachers, by teachers of
Mm,
classical architecture, and by humanisms of different kinds. And if I find myself in an era when humanism is in disrepute
right.
because of post-humanism.
Right.
But in my view, post-humanism is still humanism.
Or
It's
human
just
post-humanism, right? I mean, it's like,
I like that too. That'll work.
yeah,
Uh, because for us to turn around and say that trees matter and spiders matter and rivers matter is an entirely it's a tribute to being human to be able to do that, because rivers don't do it and spiders don't do it and animals don't do it. Humans do it. It's noblesse oblige. It's like, this is what we owe.
yeah,
We're not the only living things. And I think
yes,
that's a triumph of humanistic thought.
yes. I mean, the fascinating thing is it's a triumph that in part involves its own deconstruction.
Perfect. Well said. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the, I mean, I would say from my meditation practice, that's not that different from the teachings of Buddhist practices.
No, I agree. I would agree. In this particular case, I used to study and practice Zen Buddhism when I was in my 20s and 30s, and that left quite a residue in me. But I also come from should we say, a Talmudic tradition, and so when I read Derrida, or did used to read
Oh, for
Derrida a lot,
sure, yeah.
it was basically, I don't know if you'd call it Buddhist exactly, but
Buddhist
it's the notion
Talmudic,
that
Talmudic Buddhism, yes.
yeah, it's like the conversation never ends and it never had beginning.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, for sure. This whole idea
yeah.
of writing in the margins is Talmudic. There's no question.
Yes. Yeah. So in the book, as you know, in part one, which we're talking about,
Right.
um, I'm a little critical of Buddhism,
Hmm.
and maybe what I'm critical of, let's just say it's true, because there are many varieties of Buddhism,
Of course.
is the Western take on Buddhism, which is sort of fed into our interest in self-development. I mean,
Uh-huh.
Buddhism has become a practice of self-improvement,
Yes,
a
yes, yes.
practice of looking for equanimity, but it's really about making oneself a better person. And why should you be compassionate? Well, because you'll be a better person if you're compassionate,
Hmm.
which is a little sort of backwards
Yes,
from a Talmudic point of view. It's like,
yes,
no,
that's
no,
right.
no, no. The reason to be a person is so that you can be compassionate.
Right.
Why be human? It's so that compassion can rule.
It's a funny thing, this whole sort of MBAing of mindfulness.
Oh, yes, yes, exactly. Well put.
Uh, and now we have the MBAing of design thinking, and we have the MBAing of all this, all this
Just
stuff.
about every there, yeah, there are people who are not business people whose shelves are full of MBA thinking.
Mm,
You know, whose shelves are all about treating oneself as a business,
hmm
like treating oneself as a business that advertises and that basic incorporation.
hmm
Yeah, it's quite distressing. All
I mean, in a sense,
very,
I get a sense from this first part of your book that that architecture as this kind of post-human humanism is not just a kind of mindful presentist being intra-subjectivity, but indeed has the possibility of giving one access or enabling the possibility of something a bit more,
yeah,
something sacred, perhaps. So you use the term sacred, you use many terms.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I do use the term. I think part one starts with a commentary on the importance of the idea of sacred space and the observation that I think architects are in the business, quote unquote, of manufacturing sacred space. Now,
Mm,
you can make sacred space for commercial reasons. You can make sacred space for religious reasons,
mhm,
but that we use all the cliches, if you will, of sacrality: tall spaces, mysterious light, extreme cleanliness, sublime simplicity. There's all sorts of gestures we make in all buildings that are echoes of our sort of religious beliefs. But those they tend to fall on the same sort of sky god metaphor, that God is in the sky, God is in the sun and the clouds and the stars,
mm,
and that architecture is what brings that down to earth. And there's, and then you can cite Heidegger about, clearings in the forest and the humans under the gods and so forth. So it's not like there's no tradition, probably from Greek tradition. But my book points out the other tradition, which seeks divinity in communality, shall we say it, or in relationships, or if you're Christian, in the Gospel of John, that God is love
mm.
and that God is immanent. So the notion that divinity inheres in the relations between people, I would say also the relations between people and animals, plants. And now that's part that I think I contribute, is that idea can also apply to buildings themselves, quite apart from people, which is to say, let's say, relationships between rooms.
Right.
I'm particularly fascinated in inter-room relations.
Mhm.
And I look to Kant for
Yes,
examples on that.
absolutely. Yeah, no, no. Kant definitely, believed in that eventing, if you like, or that happening. And I think that's a fantastic possibility, and that's the post-human in the post-human humanism, right?
Yes, very good. Exactly. Yeah.
To admit to that possibility and to recognize that it's been there for a long time, and that when Kant spoke of our stewardship and responsibility to that, it was not an authorial gesture of taking control or sort of genesis of birthing something. It's like let's not make sure that if there is some kind of a conversation amongst rooms, we don't screw it up to begin with.
Yeah. Well, a plan is a society of rooms, he said.
He did.
And that's the trouble with Kant. He was actually very, very serious when he said these things. But he's more or less, maybe that's going to be true of all pronouncements by architects. They're thought of as just serving a style. Like, you'll say anything to make the way you do buildings look better. But I think he
Well,
really, really meant it.
that's
That
true.
if a plan is a society of rooms, that means all the categories that apply to social organization actually apply to buildings. A building is a social organization. And in parts 2 and 3 of the book, we really sort of go into it.
I mean, I come at this some of this from a very simple physics perspective as well, which is that of course they are. I mean, there is order everywhere in the universe, and there are things doing their stuff everywhere all the time, and having organizations and relationships and fights and exchanges and energy differentiations. There's stuff going on everywhere all the time.
Vikram, you're a teacher of architecture, are you not?
I am.
And how often do you hear students being able to operate at that level?
Yeah, no.
And how often members of our profession operate at that level?
No, I know.
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, we push in the studio this whole idea of express yourself.
There's no right or wrong here. There's just the integrity of your idea.
Yeah.
And how you bring it out. But since I've in especially the last few years, but really pretty much all my career, I try to convey to students that that if you put two chairs in a room, they're already in conversation, even when you leave the room. Those two bookcases behind you, I guarantee you have feelings about each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, that reminds me of you remember the new drawings in Delirious New York?
Yes, exactly.
Rem didn't do that.
I mean, that's what's funny is that when you go the animist route and you say, listen, everything has a life, or if you go triple O, object-oriented ontology, which is another manifestation of this idea. For architects, it's a dangerous path because it's easy to trivialize and to turn into cartooning.
Of course, yeah.
Like if you read Learning from Las Vegas and the early postmodernists, Charles Jenks, they tapped into this. They knew that buildings are like beings and that they have a life, but it very quickly degenerated into a cartoon.
It did.
And that's the amazing thing about Khan is he used an extremely austere language of construction and form and geometry. I think deliberately to not allow the shapes of architecture to turn into illustrations, comic book illustrations. You want a building to feel like a dinosaur, act like a dinosaur, but not look like a dinosaur. You have to sort of go to the essence of dinosaur somehow, because a building is a building is a building. It's not a picture of something else. And that's always the hard thing to convey as a design teacher.
It is. How do I know the difference between a cartoon and a conversation?
Well, Vikram, you probably have your own ways of getting to that point. And my hope is that my book sort of reopens that conversation,
right,
and points to some very great architects that have managed to give life to buildings themselves, give life to rooms, give life to objects, and step aside and let those beings be in divine relation to each other and not always make it about your experience.
One of the things I have been into recently, the last few years, is fashion. The idea of clothing as architecture.
Yeah, sure.
But of course, fashion suffers from ancient, or rather, not an ancient, really a modernist deprivileging and sexism. We suffer under that.
Well, there's something similar to. I've always thought there's a parallel between, putting on a coat and just feeling yourself in the coat, and maybe stepping in front of a mirror and just sort of, brushing yourself, just making sure that it's sitting on your shoulders right, and you feel the coat making you into a different person than you were without the coat.
Yeah.
Make the parallel between that and walking into a building, that when you walk into a building, you sort of put the building on.
Yeah, you do.
You open the doors, they close behind you, and you've put on a coat. you've put on the building.
Yeah.
And now your whole being is represented by the building. The building is now the outside of you. And the same with every room. So I think the parallel is quite profound. And I don't know that that necessarily takes you into a conversation about fashion, right? I mean, there's a way to talk about clothing without going, okay, this year it's stripes, next year it's dots.
Oh no, I mean that's an industry. I mean, we can, discussion of architecture doesn't take us necessarily into a discussion of real estate, right? I mean, that's the same.
Yeah, right.
Of course, architecture
Yeah.
is real estate, but there is architecture and then there is real estate. Similarly, there is fashion and then there is the fashion industry.
And I think even in the fashion world, there are personalities. The great fashion designers were actually not as trivial as we make them out to be. I think they were very deeply understood what clothing is and what clothing does. And I think that's the same is true in dance. In all the sort of the expressive arts, is that the pioneers in them were not shallow individuals.
Well, I would argue, Michael, that unlike our shallow postmodern intuitors of the 70s and 80s in architecture, I believe some of the other arts actually did a much better job of carrying that intuition of postmodernism into much higher expression, particularly in fashion. And I am obsessed with the work of Alexander McQueen. I don't know.
Oh yes, yeah.
And I think he got it. He had it. And the book that I'm working on for next year is on the life and work of Alexander McQueen as architecture. And I think that the shows that he put up, and not the line, that came out of, the line's great too, but the shows that he put up are profound readings of post-human humanism. Let's put it in your lexicon. So yeah, anyway.
And I think there are parallels also with, aside from fashionability, that the thing that changes every few years, which I think is where everyone's mind goes to when you talk about fashion. Yes. There's also a strange magic of quality. Like the $200 or $300 black T-shirt, which makes most people just like giggle. Like, what kind of fool would spend $200 on a black T-shirt?
Right.
What kind of fool would spend $1,000 on a jacket?
Yeah.
It becomes sort of laughable, and until you yourself pick up a $200 T-shirt and feel it in your hands, you yourself put on the $1,000 jacket and look in the mirror and go, or just touch it with your hands and go, oh my God, I didn't know a jacket could do this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think architects are the same way. It's like, what? $1,000 a square foot? What are you talking about? $2,000 a square foot? And you go, yeah. And if you spend that with a good architect, you're going to feel it the rest of your life, and you'll know it.
Yes.
Every dollar will speak to you.
Yes. Yes. There you go.
Yeah.
The best designers, fashion designers, are our first cousins. They are in the business of building an habitat for the body.
Yeah.
Not in the Heideggerian sense, and in the sense that you're talking about.
Yeah. So I think architects are constantly in the business of defending refinement, or defending connoisseurship, or defending fine points, defending budgets. Like, why would you want to spend that much when you can do it much more simply, using this or that convention of construction?
Formula, form follows function, and utilitarianism have these things done us disservice to that extent?
Oh, for sure. It's called Gresham's Law. The Earl of Gresham, he was like 1750 or 60. He was the finance minister to Queen Elizabeth I. And he invented a law called Gresham's Law. And it said, Gresham's Law says, bad money drives out good money. Okay, and the reason bad money drives out good money is because the value of money is in what people think it is and not what it actually is.
Mm.
And so a silver dollar is worth $1 and a gold dollar is worth $1, but gold is worth more than silver.
Mm.
And so in the history of currency, countries would continually reprint their currency or remint their currency in cheaper and cheaper metals,
Right.
which will enable them to print money. So the metaphor is, between any two products, if you can't tell the difference in quality, you will buy the cheaper of the two. If two things look equal in quality to you, you will buy the cheaper. That sets up a dynamic where the presentation of quality is not the same as the existence of quality. So you might have a car with leather upholstery, but it's actually only the seat is leather, but the back is plastic. Or you might clear cut a forest all the way to a highway, but then leave 100 feet of trees. Because the
Yes.
idea is that if you drive along the road or you see trees and you don't realize it's being clear cut all the way to 100 feet within.
Mm.
So it's kind of value engineering. You just go to where the value is perceptible and then you drain the rest because it's costing you money. So there's a sense in which architects need constantly to say why quality is worth the money.
Right. Yeah, and in that sense, they have been disserviced by their alliance to, I would say, the art world, because we have been sort of produced as artists who kind of are to be thought of as misunderstood individuals and
Mhm.
there's items for the rich and famous, rather
Yeah,
than
well, it's also we're also
priests of.
and also the cult of experientialism, Vikram,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
the experience is always of surfaces. The experience is always of the outermost shell of things.
yes.
And if you keep focusing on that, then there's nothing necessarily behind it.
Mm,
There's, the first lick of the ice cream is all that counts.
right.
Um, so, and I think architects, insofar as they cast themselves, and this is in the book, The Experience Economy, insofar as architects join the experience economy and see themselves as kind of entertainers with buildings, then, you're going to find cheaper and cheaper versions
Of
coming to the
entertainment.
fore by Gresham's law.
Yeah. Versus priests of the sacred.
Yes. And, I hesitate to say architects should be priests or rabbis or mullahs or whatever. I think that's probably a very, very bad idea from a PR point of view. But I think if you look at the quote unquote great architects, they were
Mm,
indeed exactly those things. Frank Lloyd Wright was, everyone is, even Frank Gehry, who was a very, very down to earth guy
yeah.
and would shrug off any sense of his own sacrality, if you will.
Mm,
Puts forward the value of conviviality as his
yeah.
supreme value.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And conviviality is, in fact, a sacred notion. God
Yes.
is life and God is love. Yeah.
So you're defining love as conviviality.
Yes, it's the same thing.
Interesting.
Conviviality, right? Living with.
Living with.
Hmm.
Is
Of
that
course, I like.
John's? Is that the sacred idea in the Bible of love that you were talking about?
I think so. It's related. I don't want to split hairs here.
Yeah. Yeah. No. No. No.
If you believe God is love, then you believe that the association between living things is the substance of God.
Mm. The word for self in Sanskrit is Atman, Atman, which is cognate with the Greek atmos,
Mm-hmm.
from which we get atmosphere.
Yeah.
Atman as self, rather than the Abrahamic idea of a deep interiority, which is, the presence of divine, who is at an infinite distance and yet within you. Atman as self is atmosphere, which is that which surrounds you.
Hmm.
And to breathe is to be. Soul,
Yeah.
soul is around, all around you.
In Hebrew, that would be neshama,
Nishama.
which neshama.
Hmm.
That is, it's the identification of the divine with wind or breath.
You're right.
So you breathe life. God, in Genesis 2, God breathes life into Adam.
Rest.
So the identification of breath with life is, I think, probably present in many religious traditions.
Right.
In
And
the Garden of Eden, God arrives as a wind. When Moses demands to see God, God says, "Okay, you can see me, but only in passing."
mhm,
So Moses puts himself in a rock, and God sweeps by him, and he
yeah,
feels the wind of him having passed. But he never sees God face to face. You can't see God face to face. You can only feel God's passing,
mm,
God's exiting the scene, like
mhm,
a perfume, like a breeze that comes through.
mhm. Right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's a more metaphoric use in there.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Versus.
But it comes up for me anyway. Like, okay, let's bring it to architecture.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm giving a project now in my studio called it's a summer school. It's a school that's only open in the summer. I won't go into details,
Mm.
and it's here in Texas, which, as you know, is very, very hot.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm not allowing the students to use air conditioning.
Fabulous.
So we're thinking of ways to be tolerably cool pre-air conditioning. But the implications are actually amazing, and the students are finding it quite difficult
Why?
because, well, because you can't just use blank sheets of glass, and you can't just drop ceilings and thread ducts through. I mean, really, a building with air conditioning is like a patient on life support,
Of course.
you know,
Of course.
with tubes going up its nose. So piping icy air all around the place has all kinds of implications. It means that you have to have completely sealed windows, which
Yeah.
turns your building into a kind of an aquarium or a terrarium that just happens to be full of chilled air. And so we have, buildings that are basically like refrigerators, especially here in Texas. So, but the point is, I'm trying to get it around to the spiritual side of this, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So the students are designing now. They have to do windows that open.
Mm.
They have to do shutters. They have to do things that slide, things that have awnings. They're doing evaporative cooling, which means sort of like misting pipes
Yeah. Yeah.
or gigantic panels with water dripping over the metal.
Right.
4 foot, 5 foot, 6 foot radius fans that are making the whole building a duct instead of being a box with little chilling ducts,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
actually make the whole building breathe. And part of my motivation is, oh, let's save energy. Let's say it's not really about sustainability. It's really about being in a building where the air is moving in a human way.
Right.
And and I've been in buildings like that occasionally. And evaporative cooling is just a marvel. But the point is, I guess, in the context of our discussion, the point is that um, not only does that kind of building look a little different, it feels bodily different. It is a different kind of building.
And it makes a different society or
And it
socius,
makes
and it makes a
right.
different kind of conviviality.
Yes.
Does it
Yeah,
not?
well said. And especially if you make that final identification, which I have actually very, very gently done with my students, that self is Atman, or that God is breath. And you start realizing, yeah, air movement is more than just about physical comfort. Air movement is about a sort of a spiritual comfort.
Mhm.
And there's something about wind in the trees that's different to, no trees, no wind.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are very, very affecting.
Mhm.
And it's the same architect's absolute abhorrence of curtains and any kind of fabric,
Mhm.
right? But
Oh,
actually, curtains and fabrics are the first thing that move when
yeah,
there's air movement.
yeah, yeah.
And people will tie ribbons to air conditioning ducts just to prove that they're blowing.
Right.
And you get the point. There's
I
like a
do.
domino effect. Yeah.
Well, I grew up in non-air conditioned, extremely hot, 110 degrees every day culture.
Ah, yes. Where was that, Vikram?
Place called Chandigarh in North India.
Of course, I know Chandigarh.
So we grew up, and Chandigarh was designed. There was no money, and there was no air conditioning anywhere. Only the interior chamber of the assembly building was air conditioned. Nothing else was air conditioned, and we just grew up with that. And evaporative coolers came in the 70s, and air conditioning really kicked in only with globalization in the 90s. It is ubiquitous unit air conditioners everywhere now.
Oh, the unit air conditioners, right?
Yeah.
Well, the good thing about unit air conditioners, I really do not actually like them because they're so noisy.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about them is that the air comes from the window.
Mm.
That is, they're usually slipped into window openings, and so at least they get something right. And the thing they get right is that the air comes from where the light comes from. That the air sort of comes from the window.
Right. Right.
So I'm pretty sure that there are better ways to do air conditioning, even if you're air conditioning. For example, you could duct the rooms so that, and I'm admitting that there's ducts now, but you could duct the rooms so that air came from the windows
Mm.
that there was on the perimeter, or that you could design for not to put duct work into a building, but to treat the whole building as a duct.
Mm.
So you introduce a gigantic fan on one side of a building,
Mm.
and you introduce pressurized walls, like perforated walls on the other,
Mm.
and the whole wall breathes, and a gentle breeze comes through the entire building.
Right. Right.
When you open and close your doors, you feel a slight pressure,
Yeah.
pushback, because there's air moving in the buildings.
Yeah.
In other words, I really think the buildings could breathe and have coherent airflow.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
right now, architects just design a building as best they can, and then hand it over to the air conditioning people, and they size the ducts, and you're done.
And then they place them all over the place. Same goes for
Yeah,
lighting. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
lights. I hate this whole business of cans in the roof, which are distributed everywhere so that
yeah.
every place can be evenly lit. I mean,
It's
for
thoughtless.
God's
It's
sake,
mindless.
it's no, it's mind. It's more than mindless. It is it kills you. You know,
Yeah,
there is a sort of
especially if you're raised like you were, and more or less as I was. But you got to understand, and I think we both appreciate that. There's generations have grown up with the fluorescent light, 8-foot ceiling, air conditioned, everything as the default.
Mm.
Like that's normal, right? So any attempt to like change that is thought of as sort of deviant in a way, or retro,
Yeah.
or like maybe you like retro motorcycles. You would just have to you know say, yeah, we're going back in time because it's so much fun to do that. um, I think it's very crucial how one presents and markets any sort of reconsideration of air and light in buildings,
Hmm.
without making it romantic, without making it like it's got to be new.
Yeah.
It can't be old.
Let's talk about growing up since you brought it up. So South
Mhm.
Africa, huh? Johannesburg, Joburg, where do you?
Johannesburg, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Well, I was born in Australia, so I
oh,
actually spent my first 6 years in Adelaide.
wow.
Um, but no, I grew up. I went to undergraduate school in Johannesburg.
Wits. I've been to Wits.
You have?
Yeah, yeah. I, in fact, even
Oh, cool.
visited Wits even before 90. Uh, before in the last years of apartheid, even the
Yeah. Did you meet Pancho Guedes?
no, I did not.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
He might have left by then.
yeah.
A wonderful Portuguese architect
Uh,
had a big influence.
do you stay in? Are you still connected to the South African sort of architectural academic firmament?
A lot of, because my education was there and there was a tremendous interest in what it meant to be authentic architecture. Several of my teachers had worked for Louis Kahn and came back to teach. So Kahn's influence really started quite early for
Mm.
me, and also for Stan Seitowitz. Do you know Stanley?
Yes, 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 yeah, yeah. Is there something to you are teaching in the United States now? I have been for a long time. This whole business of I keep thinking Derrida started in Algiers, Julia Kristeva started somewhere. So many people. Is there something? Do you feel like was it just an accident that you happen to have all this sort of experiences growing up in a certain kind of education that has stayed with you? It's just an accident. It could have been anything, anywhere. Or is there something to this sort of journey and being placed here and that distance of having traveled and left behind a place that uh, plays into uh, one's life late, even years on?
Yes, I think so, and I think it's probably true for you. And gosh, how many South American architects have
Yeah. Yeah.
raised into the firmament of great American designers? Um, I think we all bring our childhoods with us, especially architects. I think your architectural sensibilities are formed quite young.
Yeah.
The
Indeed.
places you played as a 5 and 6 year old,
Yeah.
the streets you grew up on, the smells, the
Yeah.
quality of light,
Yeah.
um, the places you rode your bicycles around,
Yeah.
the weather, the smells. I do think that stays with you.
It
And
does.
I think to a certain extent, as a grown designer, part of you is trying to return. Part of you is trying to go back home.
Mm.
Um, like I believe the latitude you grew up at makes a huge difference.
Mm.
Like I think you're probably living at a much more northerly latitude than you were raised at.
It's killing me, Michael. I
Yeah,
need to move down to Phoenix.
yeah. Well, one of the reasons, aside from the fact that the colors are different and the green of the trees is different,
Yeah.
and it rains so much where you are, um, but part of it is simply simple stuff. I think like day length. Like
Mm.
when you grow up, and it doesn't really matter now north or south, but there's a certain distance from the equator, which the length of the day in the summer, the length of the day in the winter, um, these things are deeply in your biorhythms.
Yeah. I
I
can
think
believe
if
that.
you
Mm.
yeah, if you move to a place where the nights are too long and the winters are too long, or the days are too long. Oh my God, I remember going living in Europe for a while in Stockholm in the midsummer, and basically it was like late afternoon at midnight, and by 2 o'clock it was like morning again. It was just too much for me.
I
Anyway,
mean, but it's a double-edged thing, isn't it, Michael? We are
yeah,
also running away, aren't we? I mean, you're probably running away from apartheid South Africa.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's what made me come. I had the choice of being a big fish in a small sea, in a small and unjust sea, or being a small fish in a big sea. And I coming to America more or less guaranteed I'd be a small fish. When I in South Africa, I had a bit of a reputation already, and an offer of a partnership in a firm and so forth. So, I took the other route. But yeah, I have memories and feelings and attitudes about places that are probably South African, privileged, by the way, white South African. Yeah,
Of course. Yeah,
and I think you carry India with you,
I do.
and I have to hope that our students benefit by that.
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. And for a while, I tried to do that almost sort of directly by running a series of studios in Chandigarh. But
How was
I
that?
also think of my children, and what is it? It's difficult to know how to offer that benefit, I guess, other than it just happens. Or perhaps the better way is that it just osmoses its way through.
Well, there are parts of my work there are lots of things I kind of go by a little bit rapidly because, the book's a finite thing. But I try as a designer and more as an academic, really, to find the science of place. Like, what is it that gives a place its geographic specificity, right? So I've not written about this in particular, but probably should someday. The color of green, like different latitudes and different ecological zones, produce a different spectrum of green. In the north, where you are, it's a deeper bluer green that most plants are.
Mm.
Here in Texas, all the greens are yellow. The
Yeah.
yellow greens, brown greens. If someone shows me a picture like in a movie, I can tell you within 3 seconds that was filmed, probably in Texas, more or less where. And it's instant, the light in the sky and so forth. I'm not as good as recognizing places filmed elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something, and I don't think that's mysterious in the religious sense. It's mysterious only because no one stopped to ask, what are the components of this?
Mm.
Average height of trees, average spacing of trees, spectral composition of leaves, color of rocks, basic geology, percent sky cover, all this kind of. I know that kind of makes it geeky,
Mm.
but I do believe that those things sort of add up to what architects say. Oh yeah, it's the quality of light. And whenever an architect says that word, it's the quality of the light, it makes me say, oh, okay, gimme, tell me.
Right.
What does that consist in?
Mm.
And of course, you just draw a blank because no one knows what the quality of light really consists in.
Right.
So, and that brings out the scientist in me. There are other things like the boundaries between sun and shade. Architects will tell you about shade and they'll tell you about shadows. But in fact, there's a surface between the volume of shade and the volume of sun.
Mm.
And that's an invisible surface.
Mm. Right.
And things happen when you break that surface. When a human being's body crosses from sun into shade, or objects, trucks, cars, buildings, are intersected
Yeah.
by the sun-shade boundary. And this happens under very specific circumstances having to do with latitude and sunshine. And you can design for it.
Right. Indeed. Aging, yes. I'm talking about the other end of the spectrum, in this sort of interactive world, the world and mind, uh, and relationality of architecture, architecture as relationality, and the sort of presence and the long presences that stay with us. How does one how in this thinking do we prepare for the end of life?
I'm not sure I have anything particularly wise to say about that. I mean, I do think that part of the reason architects become architects is because their work outlasts them. I sometimes, I don't worry exactly, but I sort of go, musicians have to live in the moment because their art disappears the minute it's performed. I mean, you can record it, which is good, but most of the other arts are very, very sort of episodic and can't be expected to be. I mean, you can archive them, but you really sort of nearly always had to be there. You have to be there at a performance. You have to be there at certain moments. And that sculpture, I suppose, but architecture especially, has this bid on eternity. And I've noticed that different architects feel differently about that. A lot of architects will say, I never think about that. Other architects will say, actually, you know what? Today, buildings don't last very long. 30 or 40 years, like a human lifetime, is all you can expect from a building.
Right.
It'll probably be torn down and built again. So don't invest in ideas of eternity. And I think a lot of architects look at Khan and think that that's a little bit of a obsessive worry about lasting centuries and ages and so forth. My own feeling is that if architects stopped and thought about it a little bit, probably one of their choices, the reasons they chose the profession, was their own sense of temporality and the fact that when they're gone, they'll still be here somehow.
So, I mean, I think that's definitely, well, a force at play.
Well,
sure.
You've heard the phrase, a thing of beauty is a joy forever.
But I've also heard the inevitable trajectory of all architecture is ruin.
It's ruin.
Yeah.
Well, listen, there's time and there's time. There's hundreds of years and there's thousands of years and then there's tens of thousands of years. So I don't know. And when it comes to immortality, I'd be happy with another 20. May my buildings last 20 years longer than me. It's like a sort of a modest request.
Modest request. That's really funny, Michael. Hey, it's been such great time to have this conversation with you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.